This video about the Sino-Soviet conflict, one of the most significant events of the Cold War. The conflict between the Soviet Union and China was a struggle for dominance of the global communist movement and for control of Asia. The two countries were former allies, but by the late 1960s, they had become bitter enemies, and the border conflict in 1969 brought them to the brink of war. This conflict shaped the international political landscape and had a profound impact on the balance of power between the superpowers. Join us as we explore the causes, events, and consequences of the Sino-Soviet conflict. During the peak of the communist movement, ideological differences between the Soviet Union and China became a major source of tension. China believed that the Soviet Union had become revisionist and had deviated from the true principles of communism, while the Soviet Union saw China's approach as overly nationalistic and potentially harmful to the socialist movement. These ideological differences escalated over time and contributed to the eventual split between the two countries. The territorial dispute between the Soviet Union and China also played a significant role in rising tensions. The Chinese demanded territorial concessions, claiming that the 19th century treaties transferring ownership of Outer Manchuria to Russia were unequal treaties and amounted to the annexation of rightful Chinese territory. Moscow did not accept this interpretation, and the two sides could not reach a preliminary agreement on the eastern section of the border until 1964. Furthermore, the Chinese also laid claim to some islands located along three rivers, which had been occupied by Soviet citizens since the early 1920s. The Argun River serves as the boundary from the tripartite junction with Mongolia to the northern tip of China, flowing in a southwest to northeast direction. Then the Amur River continues to Khabarovsk from northwest to southeast, where it is joined by the Ussuri River running from south to north. China contended that the islands belonged to their side of the river if demarcated in accordance with international law. Conversely, the Soviets maintained effective control over nearly all islands along the rivers. These territorial disputes further strained the relationship between the two countries and contributed to the Sino-Soviet split. In the 1960s, tensions between the Soviet Union and China intensified. Both sides were building up their military presence along the Sino-Soviet border, with the number of troops on both sides increasing dramatically by 1968. The key moment in escalating Sino-Soviet tensions came in August 1968, when the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia and proclaimed the Brezhnev Doctrine. This doctrine declared that the Soviets had the right to overthrow any communist government that was diverging from what was defined by the Kremlin. Mao Zedong, the founder of the People's Republic of China and the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, saw this as a direct threat to China's sovereignty and launched a massive propaganda campaign against the Soviet Union, accusing them of imperialism and revisionism. Mao feared that the Soviet Union would use the Brezhnev Doctrine as an ideological justification to invade China and overthrow him. Moreover, Mao Zedong had condemned the Prague Spring, a period of political liberalization in Czechoslovakia, as revisionism. He saw the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia as a violation of the principle of non-intervention in the internal affairs of other socialist countries. The invasion also threatened China's goal of becoming the leading socialist country in the world. The Romanian leader, Nicolae Ceausescu, also denounced the invasion of Czechoslovakia in a speech that was seen as a declaration of independence from the Soviet Union. This event complicated Soviet relations with China further, and Romania began to move away from the Soviet sphere of influence towards China's. On March 2, 1969, a group of Chinese troops ambushed Soviet border guards on Zhenbao Island, resulting in heavy losses on both sides. While both sides have blamed each other for the start of the conflict, a consensus has emerged that the border crisis was a premeditated act of aggression orchestrated by the Chinese. However, the reasons for the Chinese leadership to opt for such an offensive measure against the Soviets remains disputed. The conflict continued over several days, with both sides suffering heavy losses, and the Chinese eventually forced the Soviets to withdraw to their positions on the Russian bank of the Ussuri River. According to the Chinese version of events, the conflict was sparked by several brawls between border patrols, with the Soviets using sticks to beat Chinese soldiers. The Chinese claimed that the Soviets were the aggressors, and that they responded with tanks, armored personnel carriers, and artillery bombardment. The Chinese eventually repulsed the Soviet attacks and successfully evicted all Soviet troops from Zhenbao Island. On March 15, the Soviets sent another wave of troops and combat vehicles to the island, resulting in heavy fighting and significant losses for both sides. The conflict continued until March 21, when the Soviets attempted to destroy a disabled T-62 tank on the island, but the Chinese thwarted their efforts with artillery fire. Eventually, the Chinese military was able to pull the tank on shore, and it was later given to the Chinese Military Museum. Despite attempts at a ceasefire, tensions continued to escalate, with both sides blaming each other for the conflict. The Chinese had been preparing for the confrontation for 2 to 3 months, and it was widely believed that the conflict had been premeditated by the Chinese side. After the conflict, the United States showed interest in strengthening ties with China and secretly sent Henry Kissinger, the United States Secretary of State, to China for a meeting with Zhou Enlai, the Premier of China, in 1971, which paved the way for President Richard Nixon to visit China and meet with Mao in 1972. The Warsaw Pact held an emergency meeting in Budapest, where a statement condemning China was proposed. However, Romania's Nicolae Ceausescu refused to sign the statement, leading to no statement being issued and widely seen as a Soviet diplomatic defeat. Meanwhile, Mao had ordered preparations for a defense in depth along the border because of real fears that the border crisis might escalate into all-out war. On 1 May 1969, in a bid to repair China's image abroad after the Cultural Revolution, and to support China for the conflict, Mao invited diplomats from several Third World nations in Africa, South Asia, Latin America to attend the May Day celebrations in Beijing. In May 1969, Nikolai Podgorny, Soviet statesman and Communist Party official, visited North Korea to try to pull Kim Il-sung away from the Chinese orbit. But North Korea declined to move away from China. On 17 June 1969, U.S. Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield wrote a letter urging him to allow a visit to China and meet with Mao to discuss measures to improve Sino-American relations. The Chinese reply was harsh, with Zhou Enlai giving a speech accusing the U.S. of aggression in Vietnam and of occupation of Taiwan, which Zhou asserted was rightfully a part of China. Nixon also visited Romania and Pakistan to pass messages to Mao, expressing his interest in normalizing relations with China, especially due to the crisis with the Soviet Union. On September 2, 1969, Ho Chi Minh, the president of North Vietnam and the leader in the war against South Vietnam during the height of the Cold War, passed away. During this time, both the Soviet Union and China provided support to North Vietnam in terms of financial aid, weapons, and resources. South Vietnam, on the other hand, received support from the United States and its Western allies. Notably, both Chinese and Soviet leaders Zhou Enlai and Alexei Kosygin attended Ho Chi Minh's funeral, but deliberately avoided being in the same room together, reflecting concerns about potential conflicts between the major supporters of North Vietnam. Messages, however, were exchanged between the Soviets and the Chinese during the funeral, facilitated through intermediaries in North Vietnam. President Nixon's message, which was a private communication with Mao, had leaked to the Chinese authorities. Zhou Enlai argued that engaging in a war with the Soviets would jeopardize China's efforts to seek a rapprochement with the United States, as their primary focus was on resolving the Taiwan issue through diplomatic means. Meanwhile, Alexei Kosygin, the premier of the Soviet Union, faced complications in his return flight to Moscow from Hanoi, Vietnam, after the funeral. Chinese authorities denied permission for the flight to pass through their airspace, leading to an unscheduled landing in Calcutta for refueling. During this layover, Kosygin received a message from the Indian government indicating the Chinese willingness to engage in peace discussions. This prompted a change in his plans, and he flew back to Beijing for the talks instead. The conflict between China and the Soviet Union served as a way for China to show the United States its willingness to engage in high politics. The conflict ultimately led to the U.S. showing interest in strengthening ties with China, leading to Nixon's visit in 1972. Despite border talks beginning in 1969, Sino-Soviet relations remained sour, and the threat of war caused China to become thoroughly militarized during the Cultural Revolution. The incident confirmed Defense Minister Lin Biao as Mao's heir.